So, Chapter 3, Key Issue 4, we'll talk about problems and obstacles faced by migrants. So, we'll look at the types of immigrants who are given preference to enter the United States. We'll look at the population characteristics of unauthorized immigration to the United States. And then we'll look at American and European attitudes towards immigration. So, intervening obstacles are things that hinder migration, and they can be categorized into two main topics. One, environmental features, so things like distance, crossing a mountain. These are physical factors that make it harder to migrate. And the other one is a political feature, such as the amount of documentation required to leave one country and gain entry to another. Or in many cases, beginning the visa application process from another country, particularly if you're in a rural area, that would be a political intervening obstacle. While trying to figure out how to cross the ocean safely, how to get airfare to cross in a plane, how to figure out how to cross a mountain, those would be environmental features. Today, political features are often one of the bigger factors. Some countries have they've adopted different immigration policies, and there's usually a preference shown for types of employment or family reunification. And attitudes about reducing migration or controlling migration are certainly not new. The Quota Act in 1921 and the National Origins Act in 1924 that were set by the United States Congress marked the end of unrestricted immigration to the United States. So since the 1920s, we've been looking at quotas and trying to control the rates of immigration into the United States. Right now, more people seek admission to the United States than is permitted by the quotas we've established. So the United States has established a set of preferences, and the preferences are given to people who are reunifying with their family, so reunification. We have a preference for skilled workers and for diversity. So family reunification accounts for about 3/4 of immigration, and that leads to what we call chain migration. Chain migration is when you move to a country because you already know someone there, you have family there, and we have a lot of chain migration to the United States. With the recent travel ban adopted by the United States, there's been a lot of controversy about. One of the items that induced controversy was this: what kind of family counted for this family reunification. So does your grandma count as reunifying with your family, your cousin? Like, how distantly can you be related to get preference for family reunification? The next category is skilled workers. So about 1/4 of immigrants come because we need some kind of workforce. Having a preference for skilled workers can contribute to something called brain drain. A brain drain refers to the disproportionate amount of highly skilled and intelligent citizens that are migrating away from other countries, like developing countries. So you can look at the number of people who come to the United States to work as physicians, people who come to the United States to finish medical school. Right now in California, there were a lot of work visas for people who can do skilled technical jobs. And in the United States right now, skilled workers, we have people coming, immigrating in on work visas to do these jobs that we don't have people who are trained and educated and prepared to do in the United States. So sometimes we need to fill a job. So we have more jobs in the tech sector in California than we have people who are qualified to do so in that area. And so they bring in workers. And then diversity. So, less than, like the rest of the migrants into the United States are allotted because of diversity issues. So they have like lotteries in countries where we don't have very many immigrants from, and they will, put their name in, and if their number is drawn, they will get to immigrate to the United States on a visa. So countries that we don't historically have a large number of migrants from can enter this diversity kind of lotto. Unauthorized immigrants are people who enter a country without the proper documents, or who stay in a country longer than their documents would allow. And that second is actually more common. So most unauthorized immigrants didn't sneak across the border without documentation. Many people who are unauthorized immigrants came here legally with the work visa and just stayed long past their visa expired. The characteristics of unauthorized immigrants in the United States, roughly 58% of our unauthorized immigrants came from Mexico. And again, this category is people who've been here for a long time at this point. So we don't have 58% of our migrants pouring into the country today. They aren't sneaking across the border from Mexico to the United States. These are people who, in many cases, have lived here and worked here for a long time. Just their work visas expired. And if they were to apply for a new one, it would be declined because they weren't here with the proper documentation right now. About 11 of the 11.2 million unauthorized immigrants in the United States, about 1 million are children. And a few years ago, we had a large number of children sent in from Central America without family because conditions were deteriorating in Central America. There were places that were really dangerous. There were essentially what we've seen as like gang violence. And these children were sent on without their parents because things were so bad. The parents were willing to put children on top of a train, not inside a train, like literally on top of a train, and send them through more than one country to get to the United States in the hopes that they would have a better life here. And I think that the conditions that it would take for a mother and a father to put their 7 or 8-year-old child alone on top of a train to send them to another country in the hopes for a better life, like the conditions must be terrible. Because in the United States, you won't even let a kid walk down the street to their friend's house without you. So imagine like how bad it is if that's what you're willing to do to keep your child safe. Unauthorized immigrants have also given birth to about 4.5 million children, which means here in the U.S., so about 4.5 million of our citizens, their parents and some of their family members are unauthorized immigrants. You can see right here the number of unauthorized immigrants from Mexico and other countries and the total number. If you look at the number of years an unauthorized immigrant stays in the United States, the duration has increased. So 35% of unauthorized immigrant adults have been in the United States for at least 15 years. So again, a large portion of people who are here without proper documentation, came a long time ago or came and stayed past the expiration date on their visa. About 8 million unauthorized immigrants are employed in the U.S., and places like Texas and California have the largest number of unauthorized immigrants. So why does this happen? So let's look at kind of the view from Mexico and the view from the United States. From the United States, we recognize some motives that would compel people to come here illegally. There are jobs here. You might want to reunite, so that chain migration with your family. And, the U.S. has traditionally advertised a certain quality of life, and other people want that life, the American dream. Other people want to live it. In Mexico, how do they view unauthorized immigration? If you are in northern Mexico, or if you are hoping to move from Mexico to the United States, you're hoping for compassion to be shown to unauthorized migrants, so they have a pathway towards citizenship. But in Mexico, particularly in southern Mexico, where there's a large number of unauthorized migrants coming from Guatemala and other countries in Central America, they tend to be a little harsher in their views because they are dealing with an influx of people without documentation. And here you can see a scene of the U.S. and Mexico border. So what are these concerns in the United States? Most people, I don't know how true this is anymore, but last year when I taught the class, I would say that most views of immigration by U.S. citizens are fairly ambivalent in nature. So people would like to see border control, but they don't necessarily want to spend a huge amount of money to solve the issue. I'm not sure how true that statement is. There are some people who are very willing to spend a large amount of money to either better patrol the border or to build a large barrier on it. There are also people who are concerned about the workplace. So most people recognize that an unauthorized immigrant would be maybe doing a job that a U.S. citizen could be. But I think most people understand that if you are working without proper documentation, you're not working the kind of job that people are fighting over. So, for example, recently in places like California, because people were afraid migrant workers were afraid to come to the U.S. because of the less welcoming climate this year, we've had crops rotting in the field. A few years ago in Alabama passed some very strict immigration control and the ability to search people for their legal documentation. They also had farmers in Alabama had crops rotting on the ground. So sometimes the kind of jobs that undocumented workers do is the kind of jobs that citizens don't really want to. It's also a civil rights issue for many people. So while most people are in favor of letting an unauthorized immigrant who's broken a law be deported, and many people aren't opposed to law enforcement checking the legal status of someone, I think most people recognize that if you stop and ask someone for their documentation that they're a U.S. citizen, it will lead to racial profiling, which will infringe upon the rights of U.S. citizens. It also leads to an increase in crime because people won't report crimes if they are undocumented because they are afraid their status, their immigration status will be checked. Older polls suggest that U.S. citizens believe that unauthorized immigration is a pressing matter to the nation, but it should only be dealt with at the federal level. And many people in the U.S. were opposed to Arizona's 2010 law that obligated foreigners to carry proof of citizenship with them at all times. Alabama had a similar one. Again, we talked about the crops rotting in the field. And more than 100 localities across the nation support additional rights for unauthorized immigration. A movement such as sanctuary cities where people cannot be deported unless they've committed a crime. I think that many people in the U.S. support a pathway for citizenship for people who have lived here and worked here for many years. And I think that if you look at the U.S. immigration website and what's required to get a work visa or to apply for a residency, and imagine coming from a less developed country and having a language barrier, you can see why it's, sometimes the paperwork isn't filled out all the way. Here you can see a migration trend across Europe from either China and Eastern Europe into Western Europe. So what kind of immigration concerns are there in Europe? And again, right now, one of the biggest immigration concerns in Europe is the Syrian refugee crisis, which we'll be talking about in class. Your book doesn't have any information on it because your book predates the crisis, so we'll be supplementing this with information in class. Population growth in Europe is primarily fueled by immigration from other regions, and this is a trend disliked by Europeans because they are afraid that the host country's culture will be lost because immigrants will adhere to their original religions, they'll speak different languages, and they'll have different food and other cultural habits brought into their country. Because of this fear, hostility to immigrants has become a central idea in most political parties in many European countries. And for this reason, immigrants are blamed for crime, unemployment rates, and high welfare costs. And this is a trend that's growing in the United States as well. This is kind of ironic because Europe was the source of most of the world's immigrants, right? So Europe was where immigration came from during the 19th century. And Europeans are afraid of losing their cultural heritage while they know that could happen because they are responsible for the number of people losing their religion, losing their languages, and the diffusion of European art, language, and culture diffusing throughout the entire world. So I guess the Western world knows too well what can happen when you immigrate into an area, how easily culture can be lost because the Western world replaced a lot of culture in the world with their own. We're going to do the Ravenstein migration laws in class, but again, most long-distance migrants are male. Most are adult individuals rather than families with children, and many are young adults seeking work rather than children or elderly people. So more males migrated to the U.S. during the 19th century. Gender started to reverse in the 1990s, so now women constitute about 55% of U.S. immigrants. About 40% of immigrants in the U.S. are young adults between the ages of 25 and 39. And recent immigrants to the U.S. tend to be less educated than U.S. citizens. Not always, just a tendency. And that's part of the reason people move to the United States is for educational purposes, right, for them or for their children. And that's about it for Chapter 3.